Imagine the last generation of humans. Everyone is old. There are no doctors, no nurses, no younger people. When someone falls sick, there is nobody to help them. When someone dies, there is nobody to bury or cremate them. According to one philosopher, this situation creates a moral conclusion that we might actually have a duty to have children. In a recent philosophy paper, The Morality of Having Children, Procreation as a Duty to Help Others, the author L.K. Elizabeth Schmidt argues that in some situations, not having children might be morally wrong. This is unusual. Most philosophical debates about reproduction ask, is having children even allowed or is it morally wrong? But this paper asks a very different question. Could having children sometimes be morally required? Schmidt asks us to imagine a strange scenario. This is a thought experiment. Imagine that humans live on another planet. Life there is very good. People have food, safety, and comfortable lives. But then something strange happens. A virus spreads through the population. It does not kill people. Instead, it makes everyone under the age of 20 permanently infertile. Only people between 20 and 45 can still have children. But those people simply decide not to have any children. They decide to be child free. So no one reproduces. If that happens, then humanity will disappear in about 100 years. Schmidt argues something terrible would happen, and she's not talking about the state of extinction here, because eventually there will be a final generation. Those who are between 0 and 20 today who have become infertile because of that virus. These people will grow old in a world where no younger people exist. Think about what that means. No caregivers, no hospital workers, no one maintaining electricity or water systems, no one to help the elderly. This final generation would suffer enormously. They would die in a world where no one is left to help them. Schmidt calls this the problem of the last humans. And she thinks we have a moral duty to prevent this. Her argument is simple. We generally believe that we should help people who are suffering. If nobody has children, the last generation will suffer terribly. The only way to prevent this suffering is to have children today. People who can reproduce may have a duty to procreate. Not always, but in some situations like this one. In other words, having children could be a way of helping other people. Schmidt believes her argument avoids many controversial assumptions. She is not saying that humans must reproduce because it is natural. She is also not saying that humanity must exist forever. Instead, she bases the argument on a simple moral idea which most people already accept. We should help others when they are in serious need. If the only way to prevent future suffering is reproduction, then reproduction becomes a moral duty. And she also considers some objections to this. One is about responsibility. Some may argue that we are not responsible for suffering of the last humans. Why should we have more children for that? There are two problems with this. One, we being responsible for the suffering of last humans is embedded within the thought experiment. And second is we don't always consider responsibility when we are trying to reduce or prevent suffering. For example, if there is a bunch of people who are affected by earthquake, say, we think it's our duty to help them even if we recognize we didn't cause the suffering to those people. And anyway, if you are somebody who thinks about suffering seriously, you wouldn't really care about who caused that suffering while evaluating the question of whether we should reduce that suffering. What about the case of using people as a mere means to an end? By procreating, are we not creating children as a means to help those humans who would otherwise be lost? Well, Schmidt says that there is a difference between using somebody as a mere means and using somebody as a means. If we are respecting them as a person, we care about their well being, and we make provisions to take care of them, then we are not using them as mere means. We are using them as means, but we are also respecting them as a person. And the ethical problem is only about using them as mere means and not respecting them as a person. So, this is not really an ethical problem. What about the case of an infinite cycle? By having children right now to help the future generations, these children will also need help in turn. and they will have to have children of themselves. And this can continue forever. Schmidt says that the duty simply continues as long as there are people whose future suffering depends on reproduction. Now, this was in a world where life was very good. People had resources and led comfortable lives. The question is, does this apply to the real world that we live in? Schmidt thinks so. She takes the example of South Korea, which is experiencing one of the lowest fertility rates in today's world, 0.7 children per woman. The population is rapidly aging. In the future, there may be many elderly people and very few young workers. If that trend continues, societies might face the same kind of problem as the thought experiment. From an antinatalist perspective, this argument raises a big problem. Yes, the last generation will suffer, but creating more people also creates new suffering. And those new people will also age. So, reproduction does not eliminate suffering, it simply pushes the problem forward to another generation. Instead of one suffering generation, we create an endless chain of suffering generations. From this perspective, allowing humanity to end might actually reduce the total amount of suffering in the longer run. So, is it better to prevent one generation from suffering or to prevent all future generations from suffering by ending the cycle entirely? This is why in chapter 6 of Better Never to Have Been, David Benatar did not suggest that everyone should stop having children right away. He argued for a gradual phasing out of humans such that smaller and smaller generations are created so that the last generation, which will suffer the most, would be the smallest of them all. In Better Never to Have Been, Benatar says the creation of new generation could only possibly be acceptable, on my view, if it were aimed at phasing out people. Unless humanity ends suddenly, the final people will likely suffer much. There is some sense in making sure that fewer people suffer this fate. This can be done by steadily reducing the number of people. Interestingly, in a footnote, Benatar already considers the scenario talked about in this paper. Given that procreators are not deterred from procreating by the suffering that their own children will endure, it should be unsurprising that they are not deterred by the suffering of the final people in the more distant future. However, if it transpires that the suffering of the final people is great enough, those people might wish that their parents and earlier ancestors had created new people. Now, to be fair, Schmidt recognizes that this duty of procreation is a limited duty and it can be overridden by other considerations. For example, having children is not an easy task and it is burdensome, especially upon women. And so, if there is someone who does not want to take that burden, then they should not be forced to have children, and so their autonomy can restrict such a duty to procreate. But I would still like to ask Schmidt, is reproduction a moral duty, or is it the continuation of a problem that never ends? In the latest issue of the European Journal of Philosophical Research was an article, Engineering Nothingness, the Limits of Human Dignity between Anti-Natalism and Contemporary Eugenics. This is by two authors from the University of Oran in Algeria. As the title says, it accuses antinatalism of being eugenic. Negative eugenics is the practice of preventing the reproduction of those who are deemed to have undesirable traits or futures. The paper claims that antenatal philosophy becomes a conceptual facade for negative eugenics, albeit in a softer form and under a more humanitarian appearance. The authors play a trick on the idea of eugenics, which involves prevention of existence of some individuals which are not desirable. The prevention of existence of these people, which is what they call engineering nothingness, is described as being antinatalism, and therefore the authors accuse antinatalism of being eugenic. For example, they say instances in which parents reject the birth of a girl may be regarded as a form of undeclared antinatalism insofar as they entail the rejection of existence of a particular child. Another example where they think that our society provides the encouragement of homosexuality as an alternative to traditional procreative family, currents of transhumanism, and pandemic warfare. In modern procreative technologies as well, like IVF for example, certain embryos are rejected and certain are selected for procreation. Now, if you consider the rejection of certain embryos as being antinatalism, then you can even frame IVF as being antinatalist. The paper was written in a very flowery and philosophical language, but the argumentation is really poor. Any selective procedure involves selection of a certain people to bring into existence while rejecting existence of other people. But the reason for rejecting their existence is not antinatalism. So just rejecting existence of certain people is not enough to declare it as antinatalism, because the reason could be eugenics, it could be preference of a boy child, or it could be preference of some other attributes which are not fulfilled by those rejected children. Whereas antinatalism would be one, rejection of all people to be brought into existence. In fact, rejection of all sentient beings to be brought into existence. And secondly, that reason is for the concerns of suffering of those people who are rejected, not for the concerns or preferences of existing people. The Virtues and Vices of Having Children is a virtue ethics conference happening at Christopher Newport University in Virginia in the US. By the recording of this video, the conference would have already happened on 13th and 14th of March. The news is Amanda Suknik and Mati Hairi would be speaking at the conference on the topic of aphilism as good perversion. And I know that after long flight delays and a lot of challenges, Amanda has finally reached the conference location seen here. And since the presentation of aphilism as a good perversion is by both Mati Hairi and Amanda Suknik, the paper is published both in English and in Finnish language. In fact, the Finnish language paper is already published in a journal called Ajatas, and here's the snapshot of the paper in Finnish. I'm waiting for it to be published in English and also for the video of the talk, which we should be able to see on the Exploring Antinatalism podcast channel soon. Kahu Advocacy Foundation, along with Bengali antinatalists, are organizing antinatalism outreaches every Sunday in Kolkata. They have an event page which says the session will examine the ethical questions surrounding procreation in a world facing overpopulation, environmental strain, and widespread suffering. Participants will be introduced to philosophical ideas related to antinatalism, responsible parenthood, and compassion for future generations. So, very good work happening in one of the most populated cities in the most populated country. Now, have you ever felt that being human is just too much? Not just busy, but that your brain is wired to feel, remember, and worry about things that don't actually help you to survive. In his paper, The Minarchy, Zapffe, Excess, and the Full Spectrum of Consciousness, David Carboni explores a haunting idea. Man is sick because he sees too much. This isn't a moral failure, it's an architectural one, meaning it has to do with the structure that produces conscious experiences rather than any metaphysical or normative reasons. Carboni builds on the work of Peter Wiesel Zapffe, who argued that human consciousness is a biological over-equipment. Evolution basically overshot the mark. It gave us a supercharged brain capable of perceiving the fractal grammar of existence, meaning the patterns of life and death, without giving us the structural capacity to bear that knowledge without cost. Zapffe believed we survive this excess of awareness only by suppressing it through four mechanisms: isolation, anchoring, distraction, and sublimation. Zapffe came to antinatalist conclusions, but Carboni differs here. He uses a striking image called the arc of the fox. Imagine a real fox seen in car headlights. She doesn't have an existential crisis. She assesses the danger, runs to its cubs, and forgets the car lights once they're gone. She is at home in her own nature. But the overwired human observer sees something else. We see the avatar fox. We see its emergence from darkness, its brief moment into light, and its inevitable return to darkness. Carboni calls this the anti-bliss epiphany. This pattern isn't in the fox, it is in the mind that can't stop seeing the pattern. According to Carboni, Zapffe made three errors. One, not everyone experiences this existential dread. Majority of people just go on living their own lives. So Zapffe was wrong in generalizing this to entire humanity. Two, the anti-bliss epiphany is one of the two possible reactions, the other being the state of bliss. The same fractal grammar that produces the stark Krushin recognition of transience, the anti-bliss epiphany, also produces illuminatedness, the bliss-born clarity of the radiant pulse of life. And three, Zapffe ignored where the problem lies. The problem is in the structure of our brain and not in some metaphysical existence. So the solution should also be rewiring of our brain. The honest response to an architectural problem is to acknowledge that the current substrate is unsustainable and that the trajectory of consciousness lies in redesigning it, not in managing the suffering of beings built wrongly for what they can perceive. This sounds like some flavor of transhumanist project, like what David Pearce has been a proponent of. The difference is that Pearce agrees with antinatalism in principle and wants transhumanism only out of practical necessity, whereas Carboni thinks that antinatalism is a wrong reaction generated in our brains to the reality that we live in, and therefore our brains should be rewired. On some notable videos, the Exploring Antinatalism podcast made a video of a fictional conversation between three philosophers: William Godwin, who was an 18th century English journalist and a political philosopher and an optimist in this conversation; David Pearce, who is an antinatalist in principle but transhumanist in practice; and Edward von Hartmann, who was a 19th century German philosopher and a sentiocentric pro-extinctionist. It was a fun conversation to listen to with so widely different perspectives. Exploring Antinatalism podcast has been a little quiet, and we know the reason. Amanda, who is the creator and anchor of this podcast, is busy in other things, but we can hope for more such conversations between philosophers from different times and different parts of the world around antinatalism. Lawrence made a video talking about sayings or phrases, at least in the English speaking world, which support antinatalism. The three phrases that he talks about are: one, life is unfair; two, death is part of life; and three, they have just lost the lottery of life. Lawrence explains how these phrases actually point towards antinatalism. Like, for example, if you think that life is unfair, then why would you bring somebody into this unfair life? And so on. Now, on to some pronatalism this week. There was a podcast about pronatalism between three feminists: Shoshana Ehrlich, who is the ex-professor at the University of Boston; Michele Goodwin, who is an expert in constitutional law at Georgetown University; and Nandita Bajaj from Population Balance. The podcast starts with Nandita defining pronatalism, where she says,
Pronatalism is a set of cultural and institutional pressures placed on people, primarily women, to have children and large families for other agendas.
those other agendas can be many different things. One is racism, and they go quite detailed into why they think that current pro-natalist wave in the US is motivated by racism. They refer to the latest natalism conference that happened in the US in Texas. They also discuss how this goes hand in hand with eugenics, the form of eugenics which was practiced about 100 years ago in the US and which was borrowed and implemented by Nazis. Now, there is one thing which I want to say about this podcast as well as pro-natalism and our opposition to pronatalism as antinatalists. Generally, in any of the movements like this or any thoughts like these, there are arguments, there are reasons behind these thoughts, and then there are some either incidental or consequential benefits of implementing those thoughts. So let's take veganism as an example. The main reason for veganism is suffering of animals. But along with that, you could also argue that it is beneficial to your health or it is beneficial to environment. The environmental or health aspects are coincidental benefits of veganism and not the reasons of veganism, at least in my opinion. Reasons are different and benefits, coincidental benefits, are different. Same is the case with antinatalism to a certain extent. The reason for antinatalism are the arguments for antinatalism, which generally come from suffering or philanthropic arguments, misanthropic arguments, quality of life, and so on and so forth. Those are the main reasons for antinatalism. Those are the main reasons why we are opposed to bring somebody into existence, human or any sentient being. But along with that, if you are having fewer children, then you're helping environment, some would argue, because if no feet are created, no carbon footprint can be created, and so on. And so my point is that this environmental part of antinatalism is a coincidental benefit of antinatalism, whereas the reasons of antinatalism are the main arguments of antinatalism. Now, similar is the case with pronatalism. The reasons for pronatalism could be that people should have children because having children is a good thing, or we want to impart pleasure onto children, or we want to give them pleasure. We think that they are deprived in some way of the pleasures of life that we are enjoying. We want to share pleasure with them, and so on. Whatever these reasons which are anti-antinatalism are the reasons for pronatalism. Coincidentally, there are consequences of this, that if people are having more and more children, then as a result of that, you would have more workers to help society, to run the economy, and so on. So there are coincidental benefits from a pronatalist point of view to this activity of having children. And so what I want to point out is that from an antinatalist perspective, these coincidental benefits of having more children, of pronatalism, are actually anti benefits. And the important point to note is that those anti benefits, whether they are there or not, are not the reason for antinatalism to be there. Let's say those benefits, which are coincidental anyway, are somehow removed, somehow they are not there. That does not negate antinatalism. The only way to negate antinatalism would be to provide a good argument for pronatalism, to have children on in and of themselves, not these benefits. So yes, these benefits or anti-benefits is what are talked about in that podcast, and many feminists also discuss these anti-benefits as being the main reasons for pronatalism, but they are not, and we should not be in opposition to them. Like, opposing them does not affect antinatalism at all. That's all I wanted to say about this kind of thing. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.